My name is Marcus Vale, and I want to be clear about something before I tell you this story. I am not a hero. I am not brave in any dramatic sense of the word. I am a man who fixes things for a living. Broken hull plates, failing pressure seals, cracked conduit housings, and on the morning that changed my life forever, I was doing exactly that. Nothing more. I was 3,000 meters above the station floor, hanging off a docking arm on Cathara Station, welding a hairline fracture in a titanium support beam that nobody would ever see or appreciate. My magnetic boots held me to the hull, my visor was down, and Kale, the small artificial intelligence living inside my work suit, was reading me atmospheric pressure reports in a voice that somehow managed to sound both bored and judgmental at the same time. "You missed a spot," Kale said. I didn't miss a spot. 3rd centimeter from the left, clear as day. I went back and welded the 3rd centimeter from the left. I didn't tell him he was right. He already knew. Below me, Cathara Station hummed with its usual organized chaos. It was one of the largest waypoint hubs in Valorian space, a place where 100 species passed through every single day, trading goods, filing transit papers, refueling ships, and carefully ignoring each other. I had lived and worked here for 6 years. I knew its rhythms, the way you know the breathing of a sleeping house. I knew which corridors flooded at shift change, which food vendors watered down their portions, and exactly where every human being on the station worked, which was always, without exception, at the bottom of everything. That was simply the way of things. The Valorian sovereignty had been traveling the stars for 4,000 years. Humanity had been doing it for 40. We were newcomers, and the galaxy made sure we never forgot it. Humans on Cathara Station were mechanics, cleaners, cargo loaders, and salvage technicians. We did the work that kept the station running, and we did it quietly, and we were thanked with slightly above minimum transit credits and the privilege of not being asked to leave. I had made my peace with it. Not happily, but practically. I was finishing my weld when Kale spoke again, and his tone was different this time. "Marcus, look up." I looked up. The Royal Imperial ship Eternal Throne was beginning its descent toward the Royal Docking Spire. Even from 3,000 meters away, it was a sight that made your breath stop. The ship was enormous in a way that simple numbers cannot describe. Nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern, its hull made of a dark alloy that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its surface covered in the ancient geometric patterns that Valorian royalty had carried on their vessels for centuries. It moved with the slow, deliberate grace of something that had never once been in a hurry. The Queen was visiting. The whole station had been preparing for a week, cleaning corridors that were already clean, polishing surfaces that were already polished, and generally making everyone in a service role extremely nervous. I had paid it very little attention. Queens did not visit docking arms. My work didn't change. But then the ship lurched. It was subtle at first, a small deviation in the approach vector, the kind of thing you might almost explain away. But I had spent 15 years watching ships move, and ships do not move like that. That was not a course correction. That was a system fighting itself. "Kale," I said, "scan that ship." "Already scanning." A pause. "Marcus, the gravitational anchor array is failing." Cascade failure, triggered by a resonance conflict between the ship's landing protocol and the station's gravity plating. The two systems are fighting each other, and the anchor array is losing. I watched the Eternal Throne tilt another 3 degrees. Alarms began sounding across the station, distant at first, then everywhere at once, overlapping each other into a wall of noise. "How long before it hits the mid-ring?" I asked. "At current rate of drift, approximately 6 minutes. The mid-ring, where 50,000 people lived and worked and ate their lunches and argued with their families, and had absolutely no idea that 2 kilometers of Royal Starship was slowly falling toward them. I stood very still for exactly 4 seconds. I had seen this failure before. 3 years ago, on a salvage freighter called the Marginal Return, the gravitational anchor array had failed in almost identical fashion, a resonance conflict so obscure that it wasn't even listed in the standard technical manuals. I had fixed it alone, in the dark, with tools that were technically rated for a different job entirely. It had taken me 22 minutes, and one very creative decision that I had never told my supervisor about. I could fix this. I looked at the ship. I looked at the clock in my visor. I looked at the distance between the ship and the mid-ring. Kale, I said, burn the suit thrusters. Get me to that ship. Marcus, I need to point out several problems with this plan. Point them out while we move. We moved. Crossing open space toward an incoming royal vessel without authorization is the kind of thing that ends careers. It is also, as I discovered very quickly, the kind of thing that triggers automated point defense targeting systems. I was 200 meters from the hull when the weapons locked onto me, and Kale made a small sound in my ear that I can only describe as the digital equivalent of a person covering their eyes. I opened the Royal Emergency Channel, which I had absolutely no clearance to access, and I spoke as calmly as I could manage while flying at full thrust toward a ship that was considering shooting me. This is Marcus Vale, salvage engineer, Cathara Station Docking Division. Your gravitational anchor array is experiencing a resonance cascade failure. Your standard emergency protocol will worsen the failure, not correct it. I know how to fix this. Please do not shoot me. Silence. Then a voice, sharp, authoritative, and deeply unimpressed. Commander Drevoth, head of Royal Security. Stand down, human. Our engineers are addressing the malfunction. What is their current solution? I asked. He told me. I listened. I closed my eyes for 1 second. With respect, Commander, that solution will accelerate the cascade by approximately 40%. You have 4 minutes and 30 seconds. I need you to let me reach the anchor array housing on the lower hull. You have no authorization, no clearance, and no right to be on this channel. That is all true, I said. I also know how to save your ship. Those two facts can both be true at the same time. Another silence. Longer. The weapons were still locked on me. Then a different voice came through. It was quieter than I expected. Older. It carried the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who have never needed to raise their voices to be obeyed. Let him proceed. The weapons unlocked. I moved. The anchor array housing was on the lower aft section of the hull. A smooth panel not designed for manual access because, in 400 years of Valorian engineering, no one had ever imagined a situation where manual access would be necessary. I cut through it with a plasma cutter rated for maintenance work on station walls. It worked, barely. You are aware, Kale said, that what you just did voided 3 separate Valorian engineering warranties. Write them a letter of apology. Inside the housing, the array was exactly what I expected, and exactly as bad as I feared. The 2 resonance nodes were oscillating against each other in a frequency pattern that was getting worse with every second. The standard fix, isolating the primary node and forcing a manual reset, wasn't going to work here, because the secondary node was already too far into the failure cycle. If I reset the primary, the secondary would spike and take the whole array down permanently. I needed to bridge them, simultaneously, while rerouting power away from the landing array so the bridge didn't immediately overload. I had 3 hands worth of work in 2 hands. Kale, I need you to manage the power reroute through the suit's external interface. Can you reach the ship's maintenance subnet? That is extremely illegal. Can you reach it? A pause. Yes. Do it. I worked with the particular focus that only comes when there is no room left for doubt or hesitation. I had experienced this feeling on the marginal return, and twice before that on other ships that were falling apart in ways their manufacturers had promised was impossible. It is not a brave feeling. It is not even a calm feeling. It is simply a very narrow feeling. The world reduces to the problem in front of you, and the tools in your hands, and everything else stops mattering until it is solved. 1 node bridged. The cascade slowed fractionally. The second node was not responding to the bridge signal. I tried the correct approach. It failed. I tried the secondary approach outlined in the emergency manual. It failed. I looked at the secondary conduit running along the left side of the housing. It was not rated for power transfer. Using it was a fire hazard. Every piece of training I had ever received told me clearly and firmly not to do what I was about to do. On the marginal return, it was the only thing that had worked. I rerouted through the secondary conduit. The second node caught the bridge signal. The resonance pattern broke apart. The gravitational anchor array came back online in sequence. 1 anchor, then 2, then all 8, and the Eternal Throne, the greatest ship in the galaxy, shuddered once like a living thing, and then steadied. 300 meters above the mid-ring, I became aware, slowly, that every channel had gone completely silent. No alarms, no voices, no Kale, just the sound of my own breathing inside the helmet. "Kale," I said. "Yes? Are we good?" "The ship is stable. The array is holding. The mid-ring is safe." A pause. "Nice work, boss." I sat down inside the anchor housing of the royal flagship, covered in coolant fluid, and I waited to be arrested. They brought me aboard through a maintenance airlock. 4 royal guards who were perfectly polite in the specific way that people are polite when they have not yet decided what to do with you. Commander Drevoth met me in the corridor. He looked at me the way a man looks at something that has embarrassed him by being right. He said nothing. That was, I think, the most eloquent thing he could have done. They walked me through the ship. Even in my current state, coolant-soaked, tool belt still hanging from my hip, visor pushed up, I could not help noticing how extraordinary it was. The corridors were tall and curved, lit with a soft light that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The air smelled of something I had no name for. The whole vessel felt like the inside of something ancient and very quietly powerful. They brought me to the throne room, and then I stopped noticing the ship. Queen Saraveth Alunvi was older than any living thing I had ever stood before. She was tall, with the silver skin that high-born Valorians develop over centuries, and her eyes were the color of deep space, dark and very still, and full of a great deal of careful thought. She looked at me the way a scientist looks at a result they were not expecting. She asked me one question. "Why did you act without authorization?" I thought about it honestly, because she looked like someone who would know immediately if I gave her a dishonest answer. "Because I knew how to fix it," I said, and there wasn't time to ask permission. I figured I would rather be tried for saving 50,000 people than be polite while they died. She was quiet for a long time. Behind her, I could see a young Valorian aide, introduced to me later as Lyra, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, not suspicion, something closer to relief. The Queen turned to Commander Drevoth and asked him, in the same quiet voice, why his engineering team had misdiagnosed the fault. Drevoth gave an answer that was technically elaborate and practically meaningless. The Queen listened to all of it. Then she dismissed nearly everyone from the room. She talked to me for a long time after that, not as a queen talks to a subject, with the distance and formality of authority, but as one person talks to another when they are genuinely trying to understand something. She asked me about the fault. She asked about the marginal return. She asked how many situations like this I had encountered. I answered all of it honestly, and somewhere in the middle of explaining a pressure seal failure on a Drathari cargo hauler, I realized that she was actually listening, not politely, actually. When she told me what she had decided, I thought at first that I had misheard her, through the coolant still drying in my ears. A Class Sovereign Engineering certification, a seat on the Royal Engineering Council, and a formal diplomatic recommendation to the Galactic Senate that humanity be granted provisional observer status in proceedings. I stared at her. She said, "You saved this ship with tools rated for station maintenance and knowledge built from fixing things your civilization could barely afford to lose. I have advisors who have never solved a problem without unlimited resources. I find I would like one who has." I asked if this was some kind of additional punishment. Something shifted in her expression, very slightly, in the way that a deep river shifts when something moves far below the surface. Several weeks later, I was sitting in the Galactic Senate Observer Gallery, the first human being ever to occupy that seat, watching a procedural debate about interstellar shipping tariffs that was genuinely one of the least interesting things I had ever witnessed. Kale was providing commentary in my ear. I was thinking about my tools, which were in a bag under my chair. A message appeared in my visor from Lyra. There was a design flaw in the station's secondary cooling manifold. The engineering team couldn't locate it. She had been authorized to ask if I had time. I looked at the Senate floor. I looked at the message. I picked up my bag, stood up quietly, and walked out of the most important political chamber in the known galaxy to go find a cooling manifold. I have never been the kind of man who changes history. I am the kind of man who figures out why something stopped working and makes it work again. It turns out that in a galaxy which had quietly forgotten to value that, it amounts to exactly the same thing.